was silent as the dawn broke over the horizon. Rachel and Adakis, the unlikely survivors of the wreck of the Vengeance, had reached the docks of Calister late last night after many hours of being tossed about by the sea. Shown to a chamber to spend the remainder of the dark hours, staring up at the ceiling above the bed, Rachel prayed silently that the goddess would watch over her father and deliver him to safety. Beyond the window of the bedroom, as the light peeked over the mountain tops in the distance, Rachel watched as tiny white glistens danced across the sky and swirled about in the wind. It was snow. The winter had been approaching quickly, and finally it had conquered the last warm breeze of the harvest time, and the cold wind of the dark, icy winter was overpowering the skies. Inky gray clouds crept across the horizon, and even the breaking dawn struggled against the murky gloom. But the white flakes fluttering from the clouds like crystal butterflies were so peaceful, so beautiful, that for a second Rachel forgot herself. She rose from the bed and stood at the window, watching the snow drift on the wind and collect on the window pane, and she almost smiled. But beyond the window, outside the gates, on the peak of the hilltop across the meadow, a pillar of billowing black smoke still rose into the sky. Adak was in ruins, and her people were suffering, hiding, or already destroyed. And as she saw, she remembered, and she grieved, her heart blazing with anger as her eyes filled with tears. Tears for her people, for her kingdom, for her father. But she remained faithful in the goddess and hoped that all would be set right and that the lives lost would not be lost in vain. And she prayed, above all, for the demise of the Dark Lord, who had delivered this grief and destruction upon them. These things she mulled over as she left her chamber, hoping to find some company to ease her thoughts. To her fortune and her relief, Adakis had risen early from his bed, having also passed a sleepless night, and was seated peacefully at the table in the dining room. A teapot rested in the center of the table, a steaming cup of tea clutched between his hands, and an empty teacup was placed at the seat across from him. Rachel did not bother to wait for an invitation, and poured herself a cup, sitting down across from Adakis and waiting for him to speak. He turned his head and offered a compassionate smile. She was seated in the place where Marcus usually sat, but his friend had not met him that morning, and Adakis wondered if perhaps word of their arrival had not yet reached his dear friend, the king of the island of Ghent. But only a few minutes after the thought was conceived, the door beyond the dining room and the foyer opened and resealed with a resounding clang. Adakis rose from his seat as the sound of boots staggering and scraping across the marble drew near to the dining room. And rounding the corner, Adakis beheld his companion in a state he had never seen Marcus in before. His dark brown hair was windswept and matted to his forehead. His overcoat was unbuttoned, his boots caked with mud, and his weary legs barely supported him as he stumbled through the doorway, looking dazed and exhausted. He collapsed in a chair at the table and rested his head back, trying to steady his nerves. Adakis raced around the table and stood before his friend, stammering with questions while trying to make sense of his appearance. Lifting his head and opening his eyes, he gazed down at his suit, and realizing how he must look, he took a moment to button his overcoat and brush the wrinkles out. But a tear in the right shoulder and the arm, which he held his battle axe in, which was now dangling loosely from his weak hand, was stained with blood. A deep wound in the shoulder had bled and stained the coat, but he seemed not to care. Instead, Marcus apologized for his entrance and his disheveled appearance. But Adakis brushed away the apology and again questioned what had happened and how Marcus had been injured. But avoiding the story for a moment, Marcus asked if Adakis would pour him a cup of tea, and it was only when Adakis stepped away that Marcus saw that he was in the presence of a young lady. Rachel stepped forward toward him, recognizing the guardian Altama's son from an introduction many years ago, and Marcus in turn remembered her and knew of the princess's recent tragedy. The two were both sympathetic toward one another, but neither spoke a word of it. It was in their eyes as their gaze met, and instead of speaking, Rachel moved to examine the wound on his shoulder, and drawing away, she called to a nearby servant for a basin of hot water and a clean rag, and before Marcus could protest, the servant was scrambling away to heed the request. Rachel had treated many such wounds during her time out to sea, and had cleaned gashes far deeper than the one on Marcus's shoulder. The servant returned with the water and rags at the same time Adakis had finished pouring his friend the cup of tea. Taking the bowl of hot steaming water from the servant, she placed it on the table and rinsed the rag in the water, wringing it between her hands as she approached Marcus, who recoiled away from her. He stated that the wound was inconsequential, and he would prefer that she just ignore it. But acting as though she had not heard the wincing young king of Ghent, she parted the torn sleeve to expose the gash before dabbing the blood away with her rag. Adakis chuckled to himself as his friend winced and hissed at the pain. When she had finished, Rachel wrung out the cloth and used a napkin from the table to bandage his arm. Crossing his arms and coiling away, when she had finished, Marcus returned his attention to Adakis, who waited with a nervous impatience to hear what had happened. And taking a sip of his tea before speaking, Marcus began to tell his story. He had followed the goddess's direction, and he had been led to many people who had seen exiles in the kingdoms. Men with the burn of the Dark Lord on their faces had passed through the villages toward the ruins of Kennedac, and before them, a young Favian woman with golden hair, passing quickly ahead of them, alone. She spoke to no one, and wasted no time in the villages, traveling as though fleeing from someone. But the Dark Lord's followers were not far behind her, and traveled the same path that she took. The goddess then led Marcus to the ruins, but among the ruins, within a collapsed pile of stone and wood, was the girl, and he knew then why he had been sent to her. It was Justine. Marcus had no time to act before the exiles were upon them, and they were outnumbered by threefold. He had tried to defend the girl, but he was overpowered. Leaving Marcus to die, exiles took Justine, and before they had gotten far, he heard them speak of Phorekos and bringing her to their master. Adakis's heart sank as he heard this. No goddess-fearing man had ever descended into the caverns of Phorekos beneath the forest, for it is there that the Dark Lord Devane resides, and there his power is unmatched. And no one but the servants of Devane knew of the location of the staircase leading down to the caverns, for it was hidden deep in the darkest and densest part of the forest. The chances of finding the entrance to Phorekos before the exiles learned of their pursuit were slim, but finding Justine would lead them not only to the Dark Lord, but to Salvador as well. Their window of opportunity was narrow, but it was worth the effort if they could find the staircase to the Dark Lord's kingdom. Perhaps then they could find the source of his power and bring his reign to an end. These hopes of freedom, of justice, of cleanse of evil, these things could be realized if they could follow the exiles to Phorekos and descend into darkness. Perhaps there in that darkness they could find a glimmer of hope.